Welcome to the Institute for New Economic Thinking. We're here today with Sara Thornton of the Université Paris Diderot. It's so good to have you here, Sara, today. Thank you for joining us. And I wanted to ask you, you're a professor of literature and you're joining us for an economic conversation. And I wanted to ask straight away, what is it that economists need to know from people in the humanities? What can they learn from them?
Well, I think that we can look at literature not simply as instruction or entertainment, but literature is a kind of living scenario. It's a scenario in which people are living, buying things, moving around, suffering, enjoying life. So it's a question of people's bodies and people's lives. And I think that we could almost see literature, and I'm a 19th century specialist, but it isn't confined to that. But to see literature as a living scenario, it's theory in action, if you like. That would be my
theory in action.
Yes, theory in action, because and economic theory in action. It's in a sense there's a kind of a big emotional impact in reading literature. And literature has become television series, it's become film, it's become all the ways in which people key into the world in an emotional way. So I think that's important to think about in terms of economics, political economy.
And what can works of fiction, whether they be novels, whether they be films, whether they be television programs, what can they tell us about economic realities?
I think that they can tell us about commodities, objects, how people display beautiful things and forget that beautiful objects have been made by a working class, have been made by artisans who are forgotten in the object. It's a Marxist idea, and we find it in Capital. And that sometimes literature can show, if you like, can put back the human effort and the travail, to use the French word, into the objects to show how they came to be what they are. I think literature can also talk to us not simply about individuals and their objects in the bourgeois home, but also the crowd, the working crowd, how crowds behave. Crowds can be consumers, crowds can be trudging to work miserably. We've seen that all in Zola, we've seen it in Dickens, but crowds can also suddenly revolt and take the world into their own hands. So I think that that's all to do with economics, and it's all to do with the movements of peoples and the way they deal with objects and the way things circulate in the world. I mean, that sounds fairly abstract, but things like, for example, in Mrs. Gaskell, in North and South, there are many descriptions, the kind of boring descriptions you want to get through quickly in 19th century novels, Victorian novels especially, but those descriptions are there as a way of describing the fruits of people's labor. These words like the words that we find in Marx's Capital, like congealed labor, that commodities, objects that people buy are congealed labor. And they're often shown as beautiful objects in a bourgeois salon, and then suddenly they become animated with life when they come into contact with people. When, for example, in North and South, the crowd of workers surges into the home of the Thorntons.
The dramatization of economic realities.
It is. It's the dramatization of a whole series of economic abstracts, such as supply and demand, base and superstructure, but that become real and that are just the one. We take away the labels, we take away the jargon, and we see little cameo scenarios in action that people can then understand in their bones, but which that can then be analysed with people and analysed with students, so that inevitably when you do a class on the Victorian novel, or you do it on early 20th century literature or modernism, you end up giving a class somewhere along the line in economics. Well, I do anyway. That's my story.
And as a specialist in 19th century literature, there's such an interesting reaction to industrialization that you find in so many of the 19th century novels. You mentioned Dickens and Gaskell, of course, and Zola. And Do you see parallels between the reactions and challenges to industrialization that might help us understand financialization and some of the things that we're confronting, the economic realities that we're confronting now?
Yeah, the whole business of finance, the circulation of money, the effects of markets, that's always an important part of the 19th century novel. I think that one of the big elements that we look at is how, for example, overseas markets, things that are totally invisible to people living in the north of England or living in London, so people aren't aware of exactly what's happening, how suddenly that crashes in on their existence. Then you get down to the details of their little home, and there's less bread and there's less cheese, or there's less clothes, and that is all because of markets which have collapsed or markets that have been created elsewhere. And again, to go back to North and South and the industrial novel, there are many instances of clear ideas of one market pushing out another, and this having an immediate, seeing the chain reaction down to, for example, the worker Higgins in the cotton mill. And I think that's where literature has its impact, is that we see single lives dealing with the consequences of massive world markets. So if you like, the insignificant, the prosaic, the everyday, the pathetic, as a kind of litmus test of the bigger, huger algorithms and abstractions of economic markets. And I think that if we can show people that, and not necessarily just Victorian literature, obviously, but all the literatures that we read, and popular literature as well. It's not necessarily, I don't like the idea of reducing everything to canonical, authors, what they call the dead white males, but moving it out to all sorts of, if you like, inheritors of the novel. For example, all the superb contemporary television series we have, some of which show extraordinary examples of the economic effects on daily lives.
What is one that stands out in your mind if we're going to talk about popular culture for a moment,
Yes.
either in film or television?
Well, I was thinking of a series I watched recently, which is True Detective, and the way that America is shown, and the way in which the sort of lower middle classes of the American police are shown to be evolving and understanding the world that they're in, and there's a very interesting class element in that series, but in many other present-day television series as well.
Would you say that one of the things that new economic thinking is supposed to do is challenge predominant narratives in mainstream economics and find the counter-narratives? Would you say that literature and art would be a place to look for some of those counter-narratives?
Oh yes. Well, I think that's where probably the counter narratives are born. I think that
Or survive.
Survive, and they can remain dormant, and then we in reading we find them again, and certain novels, certain ideas suddenly take on huge relevance as the world changes. And I think now, some of the things that we've been hearing and discussing in the INET conference, the fact that incomes have not moved in the lower echelons of society for 30 or 40 years, and that those things, this kind of gradual pauperization which is going on, is something that is seen again and again in the 19th century novel and early 20th century novel, and that we can go back to them and find a discussion of those problems when we read, as we read.
On the subject of inequality, you've observed that the novel in its very form and the way it's distributed challenges inequality. Can you say a little bit more about that and how the novel does that?
Yes, I think that we have to know that because of print culture, because suddenly print and paper became cheaper and people could have serial novels, so that people could buy a little chunk of a novel for very little money. There was a huge mass diffusion of writing, which had just never happened before, and that this is in fact it's an economic unit. It's very important to understand that that is also a democratization of literature, and that people could receive small amounts of information in small bite-sized pieces. In a sense, what we take for granted now with the internet and the way we take in very short pieces of information, like everyone says nowadays that we think in SMS, we think in Twitters. It was already the case to a lesser extent in the 19th century that people would receive a small chapter of Dickens, they would read it and they'd wait for a month to get the next one, or if it was the cheap edition, they'd wait for a couple of weeks. But that means that information is more digestible to people who haven't had a good education, which was the case. It was the newly literate people who started reading, for example, Dickens's novels or Gaskell's novels, and then they would be able to assimilate that information. And also it's a very, very powerful sort of propaganda machine. I use the word propaganda carefully, but it means that you could give people information, get people thinking about things in small doses, which of course works much better than blasting them with a speech which is too long or a book which is too heavy and thick. So I think that there's an idea of tuition in the serial novel, of making literate, of making people think through things. And there was also the economic factor, was that it was accessible to them. They could actually buy it. Like the Dickens monthly number was 1 shilling, which was still expensive, but it means that several people could club together and buy it. Or it means also that in the cheap edition, which Dickens made for even poorer people, they could pay a couple of pennies for a chunk of text which was literally cut like a cake, so that it would end with the word "the," and they'd have to wait for a couple of weeks to continue the sentence.
So it almost sounds like it's a major source of economic information for ordinary people, and it sort of gets economic theory out of the hands of the high priests,
Yes.
and into the the hands of the masses. And would you say that's still true today?
I think it's still true today. I think people are incredibly empowered by what they can watch on their cell phones, or what they can receive in terms of stories, very sophisticated, very beautifully written stories, like in the 19th century. I think it gives people counter narratives. I think telling stories is what gives people power, and I think that's how the world changes. But I think it does change through narratives and humanities. It's not enough just to have technical knowledge. And of course, I'm preaching for my own world here, and I'm preaching for the humanities, but I do think that the humanities is what motors and gives us change and new ideas.
Elizabeth Gaskell's novel, North and South, concerns the tensions between the industrial North and the sort of rural and to some degree metropolitan South, which I find quite interesting, considering the tensions that exist in Europe today between the North and the South. Do you see some of the same themes playing out in our economic discussions of Europe?
Oh, yes, I think that now, of course, the world which is played out in England, in Gaskell, between Manchester and London, has been shifted on a massive global scale. And I think in some ways, what we need to think about is that we're not like Margaret Hale, where we can wander about the streets of Manchester and meet a worker like Higgins and understand the whole of the plight of the British working classes, or the world's working classes, that we're not wandering about in the right spheres in India or in Bangladesh, and to see where people are making clothes and being badly paid. That we don't see it, it's gone, it's far away, it's what you hear about occasionally in the news. So it's become much more global, and therefore for some much easier to occlude, not look at. No one wants to think about it. You just want to go to Primark or H&M and buy your clothes and not have to think about actually who made them. But I think that literature and film and cinema can do that for us, can put us back into the reality of that world. And I think there is the North-South divide, and it is also the divide of capital, like amassing riches, wealth, and the workers who, on the other side, the labour. the labour who made it. And it's bringing the two together. It's the clash of the two that I think is interesting. But for people to understand it, they've got to see something. They've got to read a sentence. They've got to see an image which shows them shows how those two things collide. And that we
A
can
final
change.
question for you, Sarah. A student of economics obviously has to learn a lot about mathematics, a lot about statistics, and so on. Would you make a case that the student of economics needs to learn something from literature, and that there perhaps ought to be some Dickens, some Gaskell on the economics syllabus? Would that make sense?
Yeah, it's interesting because I was thinking when we were watching Thomas Piketty and all his incredible graphs, and they're such superb graph charts. I mean, I've never been one to be excited about a schema, a graph, but these were so shockingly parlant. They said everything. And I was thinking that when you see that, you want to make the story that goes with it. And I was wondering whether with economics students there wouldn't be a great module to make, which would be to get economics students to read a novel and make the economics from it. Transform the novel, transform North and South or Mary Barton by Gaskell or a Dickens novel into figures, into algorithms, but start with the literature and say, okay, what are you going to do with this? What can you make of this? Can you give us a reading of this which could then translate into statistics?
Interesting. In terms of prices or wages, like where would the figures be located and documented in the novel?
Yes, that's right. And to say, and even perhaps cheat a little bit and go and look at sources and say, okay, so why did the cotton workers in Mr. Thornton's mill have an uprising? What was their problem?
Yeah.
And to work it out and work out the figures and also work out things like, what people were eating.
Yes.
And what would it actually feel like to survive on half a loaf of bread and work in a cotton mill for 12 hours? That kind of thing, which is economics, and can be also the very most abstract economics, but which comes from a visceral experience. Is that very good? I shall steal that sentence. That's very nice. A visceral experience, which you can then, pourquoi pas, translate back into figures, translate into the language of hard economy, to show that it can be done, but to show that you then have to switch back to.
Yes.
That would be my dream.
We have a great precedent for that. Yes. In Piketty, because he's certainly using.
Yes, and he does that. He does that beautifully.
And Balzac as evidence.
Yes, the evidence that we need to find. Yes. So I'd love to. If any group of economic students wants to do that, I'd love to do that.
Fantastic. Yeah. Thank you for being with us today,
thank you very
Sarah,
much.
and sharing your insights. We'll look forward to more.